My name is Janet Gillis, and we're here to talk to you tonight about anxiety. We're going to do things a little differently from what we've done in the past, and it's important that we just take a few minutes to set the stage for what to expect in this series. This is a big and important topic, and we really want to be able to dive into it properly, which is why we're devoting, a total of 3 sessions that will serve to build off of one another. So our first session this evening will really focus on delivering important content to you that will serve as our foundation to build in the next sessions to come. So for this evening, we're going to be asking you to do some reflecting and sharing your thoughts throughout over the chat. And over the next 2 sessions, we'll be able to spend more time addressing your questions directly, particularly in the 3rd session. So promise we'll spend, give ample time for that. This is just a way to sort of set the stage, as it's really important that as a group, we have a good understanding, of the concepts and the framework that we will be discussing tonight. So what are we going to be doing during these 3 sessions? What are we going to be focusing on? We're obviously going to be talking about anxiety, though not sort of through that traditional sense. Most of us have a good understanding of what anxiety looks like, what it feels like. So we will spend time discussing what drives and sustains it and how it functions and how it manifests. And this will give us a common language and understanding, and like I said, a framework to refer to. We're going to be talking about the impact that anxiety has on our children and also on our families as a whole, because anxiety can be very disruptive and destabilizing, not just for our anxious or worried child, but for all of our family members. We'll be discussing some of the common pitfalls that parents and caregivers can find themselves in and how they tend to perhaps keep us feeling stuck. We'll also look at how we can take a new position in relation to anxiety, and one, you may not have considered before or tried out. And of course, to answer the question, what can I do as a parent to actually support my child to help improve their functioning and their ability to cope? So the series will be mapped out in a very practical way, giving you practical strategies that are evidence-based and research supported. But remember, it's going to take us 3 sessions to get there. So it's important to note that much of what we'll be sharing with you tonight is based on and developed through best practices that's been developed through a program at the Yale Center for Childhood Anxiety called SPACE. And SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. This is an evidence-based program for parents to improve their ability to help manage their child's anxiety. Now, we're not all going to be in a position to take this training and take this program. The premise of this program is what we are going to be sharing with you this evening. But as well, there's a wonderful book by the author Eli Leibowitz, who really maps out this exact program in his book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. And personally, this has not only changed the way I support my own children, but it's also my belief in my ability to be able to do so. So we're really excited to be here. And I invite you this evening to really take in this information, reflect on it as we go, and know that, like I said, we'll have the opportunity in the coming sessions to dig further into, questions and strategies. So here we go. I'm going to pass it over to Zamira.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I see people still entering into the webinar, but we're so welcome to everyone and welcome to those who are coming in. So we will get started. So we're going to start with some facts about anxiety. What I wanted to share with you today is about 5 important things that I want you to keep in mind with anxiety, and then I'll give it to Jana to tell you a little bit more about how anxiety works. So the first thing that I really want you to take away is that experiencing anxiety is normal. Anxiety is a normal human condition. And even though we're doing a webinar on anxiety and we worry about anxiety and we feel the anxiety, anxiety is a normal thing that we are all experiencing at some point during the day, during our lives. And we have to remember that we're not going to never experience anxiety, right? And that's true for our children as well. In addition, it's one of the most common mental health problems that you see with children and adolescents. So when I work with kids, and I work with kids every day, many of them, no matter what is the reason that I tend to see them, they experience some form of anxiety. It's pretty common, and it's something that we also know is very treatable. It's one of the most treatable conditions. We know that many people have experienced anxiety, know how to handle their anxiety, and have overcome their anxiety. And there's been so many different evidence-based approaches that have helped over the years. And we're going to focus on one approach today that has been really researched quite a bit in the past 10 years. And the last thing that I really want to share with you, for some reason, it's not coming up. I'm sorry that I'll keep talking. The bullet isn't coming up. And the last thing that I want to share with you is that anxiety in kids and anxiety in can be very different when it's manifested on a continuum. So you have kids who have maybe mild anxiety, and you have kids who have severe anxiety. And this approach that we will be talking about is true for whatever level of anxiety that you are experiencing. So when you implement these kind of practices with kids with very mild anxiety, it's probably going to have a big effect, and you will see a lot of improvement, and it will be easier to implement. But if you have a child who's diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and has severe anxiety, these practices are still important and can still be helpful, but you may need support in order to implement them, or further intervention to help manage your child's anxiety. But regardless of where your child is on the continuum of anxiety, these approaches still are pertinent. And then the fifth thing that I want to share with you is that anxiety in children or young children is a bit different than the anxiety that you see with adults. When an adult is anxious, they respond in a more individual way. We feel anxiety, we decide, what am I going to do about it, right? However, very young kids who feel anxiety or fear or worry, they tend to rely on adults to help them, right? By crying, by yelling, by flailing their arms, right? It's a message to caregivers that they need help. And this is how we are wired, because young kids or babies cannot take care of themselves, right? When they're very young. We're not able to do that. And it's true also for other mammals. And that's why parents intuitively, when they have a kid who is, showing anxiety or showing distress, step in order to take care of the child. And this is what we're wired to do as parents as well. And this is really important to keep in mind as we move on and talk about the things that we are going to be talking about today. Now, young kids do need us to step in and help them deal with their fear, their anxiety. However, as they get older, they can learn and should learn that they don't always need to rely on adults, and they can handle some of their anxiety and discomfort on their own. But we have to remember that this is gradual. This is not something you learn overnight. Just like if you think of how you teach a child to feed themselves, we don't teach them to feed themselves when they're 6 months, right? They start off by being fed, being held, being directed towards the nipple, towards the food. And we hope that by the time they're 10, they're able to use a knife and a fork and cut their food and be able to actually feed themselves. But it's a gradual process. And this is not any different when we're talking about anxiety, handling difficult emotions, and handling those discomforts that come with feeling anxious. So this is kind of the premise of what we're talking about, and we would really appreciate you keeping that in mind. So now Jana will talk a little bit about what happens when we feel anxious.
Thanks, Samira. So when we're feeling anxious, we like comfort and certainty in our world, but we all know that life doesn't just give us these constants. When we feel anxious, worried, overwhelmed, distressed, we seek comfort and certainty. That is our natural human reaction. How do we tend to do that? Well, we tend to engage in avoidant behaviors, right? We escape or avoid the things that make us feel yucky, which again makes sense. We don't like to feel bad. And if we can avoid things that make us feel bad, this gives us relief, right? So, example, being asked to do something that's really difficult that we haven't done before. We don't know how it's going to turn out, like going to a new place, starting a new school year, trying out for a school team or a play, and our child doesn't know if they'll be chosen, right? This elicits discomfort and uncertainty, and that can lead to this natural reaction of wanting to avoid. And we tend to make anxiety somewhat complicated when it's actually relatively straightforward. So what I mean by that is anxiety is made up of these patterns of it's predictable, right? Anxiety presents in a fairly predictable way in our children if you think about it. For me, Sunday night is pretty predictable, of not maybe feeling that I want to go to bed and get up and go to school in the morning. Having a substitute teacher for the week, that's pretty predictable that my child's going to start to feel that anxious feeling, that discomfort. Anxiety is redundant, meaning it likes to come back. It's not usually a one-shot deal, right? Or it's not really anxiety. So it's redundant and it's persistent, right? It likes to hang on, it likes to hang out, and it's not easily extinguished. So things to keep in mind. So we're not trying to not feel these things. The goal is to not get rid of anxiety and the yucky feelings it produces. We actually want to come to expect it to some degree and to be able to cope with it, which is actually, what makes the feelings around it less intense and more manageable. So Zamir is going to talk to us about what that cycle looks like, when we experience anxiety.
Yeah, so this cycle really illustrates how anxiety works. So as you can see, I think my cursor, I hope everybody can see my cursor, at the top of the cycle here where we see anxiety, discomfort, fear, that is the feeling that we initially have. We need to go to school and we feel anxious about it. We need to do something that we haven't done before and it seems daunting and we feel the fear of doing it. And that's the feeling that is elicited. That's what we call usually anxiety. And then we don't feel like we feel the discomfort of it. So initially what we would like to do is avoid, right? We don't want to do it. I don't want to go to school. It's too stressful. I don't want to take the exam. I don't want to meet these new people. I don't want to speak up in front of others. Sorry. I don't know. There we go. And we avoid. And avoidance is great because it makes us feel good in the short term, right? I haven't gone to school today. If I'm a child and I'm staying at home, the anxiety has gone away. I don't have to face school. I don't have to face the things that are making me anxious. But by doing that, although we get short-term relief, we don't get an opportunity to learn how to cope. We don't get an opportunity to learn that even though we felt anxiety, we can be okay, and which is a very important lesson. And in fact, in addition to that, we are learning that avoidance actually helps, makes me feel better, right? The problem with that is that the next day, when you're feeling anxious, the anxiety grows. It becomes even more so because you haven't been to school. Now you feel even more anxious. You haven't learned how to cope. You have no strategies. You want to avoid again. And as we continue with the cycle of avoidance and continued inability to face the thing that is producing anxiety, we become more and more anxious until it becomes quite debilitating. In fact, when we talk about school refusal or kids who maybe refuse to do things on their own, it doesn't start that way. Kids don't suddenly not go to school. It starts with, it's stressful, I can't go, they stay home, they miss more and more days. And as this perpetuates, the avoidance becomes so severe that the anxiety becomes more severe. So what I want you to keep in mind when you look at this is what we're going to really address is how to break that cycle of avoidance. It's right here. That part we need to work on so that you do not avoid, that you are able to continue doing whatever it is that's creating anxiety. And paradoxically, we also say that we are not necessarily teaching kids or working with kids in order to eliminate their anxiety. We often think this is what we need to do. Because if they learn how to cope and handle the anxiety, and be able to move forward with the anxiety, we actually are going to teach them a skill that will serve them for the rest of their lives. And we now know also from a lot of research that even though anxiety and fear doesn't feel good, most of the anguish that we feel when we're anxious doesn't come from the anxiety itself. Most of the anguish actually comes from the mindset that we shouldn't feel anxious, that feeling anxious is a bad thing and it needs to go away. And this is a very important point to make. Now, having said that, and I know because I'm saying it, because even though I can't hear what you're saying, I have this from many parents when I tell them this thing. This doesn't mean that we don't ever aim to teach kids how to calm their bodies, how to take a deep breath, how to maybe take a walk when they're anxious, and all those other strategies that we often use with kids. It doesn't mean we don't do those things, but the main thing we focus on is learning how to cope with the anxiety. And these strategies are alongside these kind of approach. So I hope that makes it a little bit clearer. And it allows you maybe to see anxiety in a different way. This is really what we're trying to do. And remember at the beginning, I said anxiety is normal. It's a normal human condition. This is part of it. It is normal. It's okay to feel anxiety. So now let's look a little bit on how anxiety impacts the family. We'll move a little bit to a different area. And the reason why we want to focus on that is it's really important to highlight this because the impact of anxiety can be so debilitating on families, and this is why we're doing this webinar, right? So often when I talk to parents, when they have anxious kids, they often feel that the anxiety or they're controlled by the child's anxiety. Things around the home are really dictated by the way the child presents with their anxiety, depending on the level of anxiety they're presenting. Sometimes family plans can be affected. If you have a child who has significant separation anxiety, you may not go out. You may plan to go somewhere and cancel your plans or never even make them because of the anxiety of the child. In addition, you can have kids who have significant anxiety that often have a lot of demands. They want you to do things for them. They want you to answer questions for them and reassure them constantly. This is a lot of energy that we sometimes expend as parents in order to deal with these moments of anxiety that can be, sometimes take a lot of our time. And lastly, parents often report feeling helpless and hopeless. They don't know what to do. They feel that this is, not going anywhere, right? Parenting an anxious child can be very daunting. However, what I want to say is that what we will present today will really show you that you are not helpless, and it's definitely not hopeless. And I'll give you, Jana, the next slide.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just for a quick moment, we want to just ask you guys to sort of reflect, on this question. How is anxiety impacting your family? As Mir said, it's not just how it impacts our child. It's the way in which the anxiety that's taking place within our children can have a larger impact within the context of a family. So if you want, just take a moment, throw your reflection into the chat. It's a way for us to connect as a group. We're all here because we have, a common perhaps experience, common ideas around what that looks like and feels like for you and your family. So we'll just take a moment to see what people have to say about that.
And if you don't feel comfortable in the chat, just spend a moment thinking about it and sort of evaluating in your mind in light of what we just discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tension and frustration, that idea of hopelessness, closeness with siblings. Yeah. Everything revolving around my child, needing lots of patience, a stressed out house, friction with our partner. Yeah. Worry, worrying about how it impacts the other people in our family. It increases everybody's anxiety. Yeah, maybe we weren't feeling anxious and suddenly, we're all feeling that to some degree. Not sleeping well. Yeah, leaving school, sleep issues. the stress of having to carry on with the things that are necessary for us to do as parents, self-esteem. Yeah.
Yes, and these are all things we hear, Jana and I, always when we're working with families who have kids with anxiety. What you're saying is not any different from what we hear time and time again
Yeah.
when we see kids who have anxiety.
Thank you for sharing, guys, and feel free to keep to keep those thoughts coming, as we continue to move through, because part of what we want to talk about next is how the approach we're going to talk about really has the ability to empower ourselves as parents. As parents, we can feel blamed or blame ourselves, and feel perhaps criticized and held responsible, right, for our child's anxiety and our response to it, right? Or we can simply feel like we just don't know what to do, like we don't know what to do to make things better. And as we will be putting the focus on ourselves as parents during this series, rather than that of our child, it can have that implicit message that I'm doing something wrong, right? And it's really, really important for everyone to hear when I say parents are not the problem here, okay? But we are part of the solution. Your child is anxious, right? They come at that honestly, right? And it's very likely that it has little or nothing to do with you. Just like as a parent, we would not blame ourselves when our child gets sick with a fever. Okay, my kids were sick this week. I'm not going to blame myself for that. I'm not going to blame myself if my child is born with a biology that requires them to need glasses, right? Or they fall and they hurt themselves at school, right? They come at their anxiety on their own. And like being sick, we adjust and adapt our behavior to help support them through their challenge. So no matter what the challenge is with our child, anxiety or something else, it's not different. We adjust and we adapt our behavior to be able to support them. And I personally found this approach to be very empowering, right? We have the ability, like I said, in many aspects of our children's life to support them and move them through challenges and difficulties. And the way we approach anxiety and the reactions and responses we have can be very, very powerful. And I mean, at the end of the day, we cannot force our kids to think or act differently, right? We can't force this change. There's not a magic wand. There's not a magic switch. If we could, none of us would be here. We wouldn't need to be here this evening. So in this approach, really we become the tool for change, right? We have control over ourselves and the approach that we use, and that's all. And when we make some of those changes ourselves, we can help our child to cope better with their anxiety. So I'm going to pass it back to Zamir to talk a little bit about the ways parents respond to their children.
Yes, thank you, Jana. I just want to add that, remember what I said at the beginning, that we intuitively are wired to take care of our children, their anxiety, their distress. This is part of why we tend to sort of respond this way to parents. And this is why we don't blame parents, because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're responding to your child's anguish in the way you feel like you need to. This is wired in us. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, so in order to be able to understand some of the changes and things that we will suggest as we move on with the series to help your child, we need to sort of first look at what most parents tend to do, right? How we tend to usually address anxiety, right? I'm going to talk about the extreme in which we address anxiety in the way parents address anxiety, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily are always on that extreme, and I'll clarify as I go along. So on the one end, we have the protecting or overprotecting parent. And remember, I mentioned that, we want to make kids feel safe. So that's where it's coming from. And the overprotecting parent really feels that they need to make sure their child is not feeling anxious, that they are not experiencing undue anxiety, that when the anxiety is showing up, they step in, they help, they want to create conditions that maybe do not trigger anxiety, etc. And then on the other side, or on the other continuum, on the other end, we have the more demanding parent. And the more demanding parent tends to sort of maybe dismiss the anxiety a little bit, expecting the child to deal with it and to show very little empathy to how they feel and how they experience this anxiety, and provide very little support. And then there's everyone in between. And really, most people fluctuate between how much we jump in and try to protect our kids and how demanding we are. And usually it depends on the day. Sometimes it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes we've had it and we just become a bit too demanding. And other times we feel very empathetic for our kids because they're showing a lot of distress and a lot of crying, and then become overprotective. So we tend to move along the continuum, more or less. But we also do know that parents who tend to have anxious kids, and when kids become more and more anxious, they tend to be more of the protective type. Okay. And so what does that mean? So let me give you a little bit of an example of what is a protective parent and the kind of mindset that they may have. So this is a parent who tends to think, my child is vulnerable. My child needs to be protected, can't handle stress, needs a softer touch. My job is to make my child feel comfortable as possible. So basically, the message that the protective parent is conveying in this kind of mindset is that my child is incapable of handling the situation. And that's the message you're giving a child when you're overprotecting them. They need me to protect them. They need me to take care of them when they're feeling anxious. It's, in a sense, a message that you're not competent enough to deal with these challenges. And the demanding parent can be very similar. You need to toughen up. There's nothing wrong. Why can't she be more like her sister? He's just clingy and is looking for attention. In this sense as well, the parent is giving the message to the child that, well, you can't really, you're not competent enough. You're feeling anxiety. There's something wrong with you if you're feeling anxiety. And therefore, there's a dismissive kind of feeling to it. So those are the very end and very extreme parts of it. And like I said, what we are aiming for is to be somewhere in the middle, and maybe give a message to a different message to our kids, that you are competent. And this doesn't end with what we say, right? When we have this kind of mindset, especially a protective mindset, it doesn't end with what we say. It also ends with what we do. So it clearly follows in our actions, right? If I want to protect my child and I have a mindset that she can't handle stress and she can't handle the anxiety that she's experiencing about going to school, for example, well, I may very well end up not sending her to school, right? If I feel that my child is weak and needs to get over it, if I'm a demanding parent, I will probably not show a lot of empathy and understanding for my child. So the actions do also follow these mindsets. And if we keep this sort of these ways of responding in mind, we know that these actions that we take tend to be things that really are important in how the child manifests its anxiety. And we call them accommodations, or accommodations for anxiety. So accommodations for anxiety is a relatively new term. Again, the research that we presented at the beginning, Ellie Leibowitz did a lot of research at the Yale Child Study Center and coined this term, which is also another term he uses, is family accommodations. And it really means any change that a parent makes in their behavior, in their response, in their action, to help a child avoid or lessens the feelings of anxiety. Okay? And this kind of accommodation is not something that, it's that need for the parent to help the child take away the anxiety and help them deal with the anxiety. It doesn't cause the anxiety. Keep that in mind. When parents accommodate their kids' anxiety, they're not causing the anxiety. The anxiety has already been there, but it can amplify it. And it can definitely help increase the levels of anxiety. So Jana will elaborate a little bit on what are accommodations.
Yeah, so let's flush that out a little bit more. So as Mira said, accommodations are not inherently bad or wrong, right? Our kids will rely on us for assistance when they're feeling worried or unsure. This is natural. And as Samira mentioned earlier, this is an adaptive trait we have as human beings. When we need somebody, we want them to reach out for support when they feel threatened or unsure. And we also want our kids, though, to be able to rely on themselves to some degree, right? To be confident in their skills to cope and to have the autonomy necessary to grow and develop. So that's the balance we're striving for. So how do we know if what we're doing is accommodating or if it's just sort of meeting developmental or safety needs within our kids? So, for example, if we are going to hold the hand, right, of our 2-year-old as they cross the street. This is not an accommodation, right? This is developmentally appropriate. This is for safety reasons. If our 16-year-old, on the other hand, is fully capable but afraid to do so, then we are accommodating, right? If we are going to help, a 3-year-old to brush their teeth at bedtime because maybe they've yet to develop that skill fully. But if we're still helping our 12-year-old to do so because they're afraid to be in the bathroom alone, and it speeds up the nightly routine, then we are accommodating. Okay, so let's just talk about a few other ways that we can see accommodations, family accommodations taking place. It can look like sort of constant reassurance. That's an accommodation. Constantly having to reassure our child that things will be okay, whether it be at bedtime, whether it's about how they look before they leave for school, with taking a test, trying new things, constantly answering questions about things that worry our children. Okay, perhaps your child is shy or nervous around others and you find yourself speaking on their behalf. That's an accommodation. Spending long periods of time with your child at bedtime. This is very common and one that can be very draining on families. Avoiding certain places or needing to accompany a child to the bathroom or other areas of the house when they're afraid, to enter or to go on their own. Someone had mentioned in the chat not going to certain social events or activities or allowing them to stay home from school, not trying new things, not going on play dates or birthday parties. And us as parents too, it's the way in which perhaps we don't go places or we don't leave our children for fear that they won't be able to cope without us. For some families, it looks like avoiding certain topics or discussions in the home that are too triggering or upsetting for their child. It could be writing notes or excusing our kids from presenting in class or participating in other school activities, right? And it can also be not telling them things, avoiding certain things, or even avoiding to set and maintain boundaries, right? For fear that this is going to upset them. So these are examples of how we accommodate in our homes. And, why do parents do this? Why do we accommodate our children? Well, accommodation in our children, accommodating to stress is a natural thing parents do, as we've said. Most parents do it to some degree. And we do this because we are attentive. We do this because we have a hard time seeing our children suffer. When that makes sense, it is absolutely instilled in our biology to protect our children from the moment they are born or even before in utero. So sometimes we accommodate because we need to get on with our day and we know the accommodation will sort of solve the problem in the moment. But as we saw in the cycle, it's really only a short-term fix. And as Zamir mentioned before, when we engage in accommodations or we over accommodate, we are inadvertently sending the message that we too feel they can't manage and that they're not capable to handle hard things and that we don't have the confidence. Right. And this can be very, very reinforcing. And this is not necessarily spoken through words, obviously, but it's through our actions. So if I'm constantly, as a parent, taking away my child's stress, it's communicating that I don't believe you can handle that stress. I need to do this for you. So although accommodations are almost always well intended, by doing so, we are actually depriving our children of the opportunity to learn that they can cope with more distress than they originally thought. Because, and I love this, this synopsis of anxiety by David Barlow, anxiety really is an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of your response to be able to deal with it, right? So we're overestimating the problem and we're underestimating that we have some level of wherewithal to push through this. So I'm going to just ask you to go back into that reflective mode, a little bit, And if you're comfortable, I'd like you to throw into the chat, how does family accommodation play out in your home? What does it look like? Now that we're sort of mapping this out a little bit more, how do you accommodate your child? Knowing that this is common and it's something that we all do. And if it's not something you want to throw into the chat, just think for a minute about what that looks like. Because I think even for myself, it's realizing like, oh yeah, that is an accommodation. That is something I didn't really put thought into that before, but actually that would be considered an accommodation. So I'll give you a second to think about that. Yeah, over preparing. Yeah, bedtime's a big one, lying in bed with my daughter until she falls asleep. Yeah, helping to brush her teeth. I'm not sure if everyone sees the chat as it's coming through. So I'm just reading some of them out as they come. Okay, the messages are coming directly to us, so we'll share them as they come. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Danielle. So we'll keep an eye on that as we go. Over preparing. Yeah, over preparing, and it's not on like sort of over reassuring, right? Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to have Zamir sort of walk us through what this accommodation cycle looks like and how it plays out, when we're using accommodations.
So I also want to add that next webinar, we are going to focus a lot more on accommodations and how they work and how we do use them, because sometimes it's hard for parents to figure out. It's accommodations, as we said, everybody's doing them. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing them. And it's really through thinking about it and understanding them that we realize that we are doing them. So I really wanted to add that for your information. But again, so this illustrates the diagram that illustrates a little bit the cycle of anxiety in a very similar way, but through accommodation. So as you can see on the top, there's a feeling of distress. Your child is feeling distress, he's feeling anxiety. You engage in an accommodation. So let's give an example here. Maybe it's a child who will not sleep on their own. So the accommodation is that they sleep with you. Obviously, the short term, there's a reduction of distress. The child is feeling much better. They fall asleep. Everybody's happy. But the child continues to depend on parents to regulate their anxiety, to deal with the anxiety, to take it away by doing this particular accommodation. And then the symptoms or the problem maintains itself or even worsens. And then the child is feeling even more anxiety. And just as with the cycle of anxiety, this becomes stronger and stronger. And any one of you who can think of accommodating your child in some way, and if you can look back at when it started, you may actually notice that at the beginning, maybe you were reassuring your child maybe a couple of times a day. And as time went by, you find yourself reassuring them over and over again and doing the accommodation many more times, more frequently and more intensely. And that it does take over in your life in some way. So if you're not, it becomes almost part of the way we are, the dynamic of the family. If you know your child has separation anxiety and you can't leave the house without them, then you just stop planning going places, right? This is how perpetuating it can be and how strong the anxiety can eventually become. So, and we have to keep in mind that if we create a home environment that is super accommodating, right? And it really is it's a good place for the child to feel less anxiety. They're feeling really comforted within the home. There's no place outside the home, and especially not in school, that can compete with that, right? at school, we're not going to be able to compete with the kind of conditions that we can create in a home that's very accommodating. And then other places become more and more challenging and more distressing and more unpleasant for the child and more difficult to handle. And therefore, the accommodation is something that we really need to address. And as I said, we will cover that and address more of that as we go on with the series in our next webinar. So what can parents do? Okay, you've got all this information. Now you have a good idea of how anxiety works. You have a good idea of the type of things that maybe amplify the anxiety, maintains the anxiety, a little bit of understanding that, well, we experience the anxiety. We're not here to take it away completely. So what can we do?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So what we can do is we're going to look at how we can increase support to our children while decreasing accommodations. Okay, so remember, we're not saying that accommodations have no place at all, or that we should be resorting to yanking them all away and using this sort of sink or swim method. This will not be helpful and will most likely completely overwhelm your child and your family. And as Mira said, next session, we're going to talk much more about how we reduce family accommodations. So please be patient. We will get there. But for now, we're going to talk about how we actually increase support. But before we can do that, we have to really understand, what do we mean by support? And this was really pivotal for me as a parent, because now that we know support is not about overly accommodating, and while accommodations can seem like support, especially to our kids, we now know that they actually serve to maintain and even increase anxiety and worry. So then what do we mean by support? Okay, support, there are really two very important components to support. One part is acceptance and validation, and the other part is confidence, right? So the best response a parent can give a fearful child are those that combined acceptance and validation of a child's fears, meaning, I believe you. Like, this is very real for my child. Even if it doesn't feel real to us, or it seems absurd, or it seems, over the top, we have this belief in our child that this is real. We accept it. We validate it. We lean into that. Okay, so that's what we mean by acceptance and validation. And the other piece is the belief that our child has the ability to withstand slightly more anxiety and discomfort than they have up until now. So when we put these two things together, when we combine these two things, that's what we mean by support. So when parents are only accepting of their child's fears and reassuring them or helping them to avoid, that's protection, right? As Zamira talked about earlier. When parents only expect their child to act bravely and they don't recognize the difficulty that they're experiencing or accept that this is real for them, and that the process might need to be gradual, that's what we call demanding. Okay, so, but when parents are able to make children feel that they do understand and they acknowledge how scared, how uncomfortable they are, and they also steer them towards just a little bit more coping with the discomfort through our confidence that they can do this, that is support. And that's where the real work lies for us as parents, to hold these two elements together at the same time, which is not always easy, because we can fall into the traps of, certainly for me, over talking, over explaining, over reassuring, or dismissing or demanding, or sort of the snap out of it. And when we do any of these things, we're falling out of support. So we're going to spend the next few minutes that we have left just going over and leaning into what we mean by really accepting the anxiety, what that sounds like. Sometimes we think we're accepting in our statements and actions, but we're actually kind of missing the mark, and how we send that message of confidence and belief in our kids, which is at the heart of support and growth.
And in fact, supportive statements can start very early. Once you see a child when they're 3, even 4 years old, and they're beginning to show that anxiety and that, apprehension about stuff, that's when we can start. We really can start quite early to give these messages. And these supportive statements look like this: I know this is hard, and I am sure you'll be okay. I see that you feel anxious, and I know you can handle it. I know you feel worried, and it's okay to feel that way. I get that you think you need my help, but I believe in you. I know this feels scary, but I'm confident you will cope. So basically, it's different ways in which you see there are two parts to it. One, the first thing and the most important thing that you want to do at the beginning is tell them you understand, you're validating, they know that you get them. All kids want to feel that you get them and you're not dismissing them. But at the same time, you also really want to give them the confidence and the belief in them that you know that they will be okay. They might still feel anxious. They might actually feel so anxious that they might not even do well, right? But they'll still be okay and they still be able to handle it. And that's why these statements are so powerful. And these statements have to be very short. They have to be very clear. It's not a discussion. It's not a debate, right? You're not having a debate with your child. It's not a negotiation. This is a fact that you are conveying to them. They might not agree with you. They might tell you, no, I can't handle it. I'm not going to be able to do it, but that's okay. That's your opinion as a parent. And you have to really be steadfast in conveying your opinion in that way. So we really have to think about why is it this is so important? And we know this is all really clear through the research that was done, that when kids begin hearing these sort of things, it takes them time, but they actually do feel from us what we convey to them. If you state with young kids right at the beginning, then they often develop these skills from a young age. But even if you have older kids who have never heard this from you, they can benefit from hearing that. We are role models to our kids, right? We as parents, we teach our kids all kinds of things. We convey to them all sorts of things. And if we convey to them our confidence and our understanding, that can go a long, long way. Now, obviously, we do this with reducing accommodations, which we're not asking you to do, but we would like you to try and sort of implement that. Maybe that's something to try until the next time. But before, I want to highlight what we mean, why we mean that these are supportive in contrast to the statements that are not supportive. Okay, so to give you a sense of how it's different, the message is different. So if you say to your child, you just have to power through, well, you're showing confidence, but there's no acceptance. I can't be dealing with this right now. How many times do we feel that way, right? When we're just like overwhelmed. When are you going to grow up already? Right? We're showing a confidence, or we're actually just dismissing with a statement like that. Right? It's hard for me too, and I do it, right? So maybe that's again very dismissive and not very empathetic, right? We're not showing any acceptance in a statement like that. And here's a statement where we do show acceptance. I get it. It's not easy. I was showing some acceptance, but there's no confidence. There's no additional confidence there where we're saying, well, I think you can do it. I think you can handle this, right? Which would come with it. And here's another one. You're fine. A lot of confidence there, but no acceptance, which can be very dismissive for kids. So we really, until next time, we really want you to practice using supportive statements. This is how we begin making changes. Changes take time. They don't happen overnight. We need to change the way we think and the way we address our kids and the way we respond to them. And this is a good way to start. Okay? And maybe you can just note how you accommodate your child's anxiety for now. So see how you do it and make note of it, because it will become important when we discuss accommodations next time. So I'm just looking at the time. We do have about 10 minutes. We've given you a lot of content, a lot of information, and we will probably review some of it next time, but we do want to hear from you. If you have any questions, if you have any things you really feel regarding the content to clarify, we welcome to hear from you now. You can send your messages in the chat.
Samira, if I could ask a question that came up in the chat, that ties in well in terms of the supportive statements. Jen says, it's very hard for her to hear these words when she's in that zone. Doesn't matter what I say, she can't hear it. What do you do then?
Yes, that's something that we have to deal with ourselves, right? We also, before we can even start helping our kids, we have to come to terms with how we feel about anxiety. And this is why we started the webinar explaining to you some of the important things we want you to keep in mind. If you can start working on yourself to feel that anxiety is okay. I see that my child is anxious, but it's not going to harm her. There's nothing will happen to her. She will be fine, even if she experiences the anxiety. Then you can then step forward a little bit and be confident, show her the confidence that you need in order for her to be able to handle her anxiety. But that is something that we need to work with as parents. We are anxious too.
Yeah.
And if we learn to recognize our anxiety is normal as well, then we then don't respond to the anxiety in such a negative way. I think it's part of the way we respond to anxiety. It's bad, it's harmful, my child is suffering, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that, that when we ourselves, as Amir's saying, are feeling overly distressed by our children's anxiety, it's hard for us to have the confidence because we're not confident in that moment that we can get through this. So we really have to dig down and find that confidence in ourselves to manage our own discomfort around our child's discomfort, which will allow us to tap into that confidence and exude that towards our children.
There's a really good question here. Carol wrote, in order to help your child cope, do you need to know the root cause of anxiety? My child can't explain why she's feeling anxious. This is an excellent question. And the reason is because this is why this approach is really works so well. Kids sometimes don't know why they feel this way. And they're not ready to talk about it. They don't even know. It's a feeling that just comes. It just develops over time. And the root cause, well, there could be many reasons. And it doesn't make any difference unless it's something that's, very, very particular, maybe medical, etc. Usually when children feel anxious, it's not necessarily why they're feeling anxious, it's how they handle it. We don't really, this is some of the mistakes that we do is we try to find out, why is my child anxious? If they explain to me, and if they manage to tell me exactly what is causing them anxiety, then what will I do? I will accommodate it. I will take that thing away. My child is really anxious because they really can't handle it when people make a lot of noise. It really triggers them. So our go-to response is, okay, we've got to be quiet. We've got to tell them at school that when, if the class is really rowdy, could she leave the class and go to a quiet place so she doesn't feel the anxiety? And this is why it doesn't work, because then the child will never learn that, well, life has moments that are quite loud and rowdy, and we need to learn how to handle them. And that's why we don't really, this approach does not look at the root cause. It just tells you, let's teach your child, just like we teach them to feed themselves as they get older, to dress themselves, to do things for themselves. Let's teach them how to handle their own anxiety and cope with it and deal with it. It's going to show up. They're going to feel anxious. There are going to be many moments in their lives, as we all know, that they're going to have to learn how to deal with those moments. And that's the gift that we can give them. I'm wondering if you can see any other questions, Jana?
Yeah, there's a question. Is there a kind of anxiety that is not articulated in words, but can be expressed in defiant behavior? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is another very common question as well. We sometimes not so sure. Is it really anxiety, or is the child just doesn't want to do what I'm telling them to do and they're misbehaving and having this tantrum? Because it's very hard to tell. normally, if you know your child well, and if your child tends to be non-compliant in a lot of things and tends to be difficult in following rules and in respecting authority and that sort of thing, maybe there is an oppositional behavioral component to it that maybe does not necessarily stem directly from them feeling anxious. But if it's very unique to certain situations that are challenging and that are difficult and that are very demanding for them, or they perceive that they are demanding, then those situations may come out as behavior problems. It's a way of avoiding, right? If I throw a tantrum and I misbehave, well, I don't have to do what you're asking me to do if I feel anxious about it. So really, you need to know your child very well and look at the whole picture. In fact, when we work with parents with anxiety, we first really want to do an assessment, a good assessment. Is the child really anxious? And is this really anxiety, or is it another problem that the child may have? So I guess we are 2 minutes away from the hour. You think we can answer one more question, or shall we end now, Danielle? What do you say?
Jana, you can see some chat questions.
Yeah, I
I
think
don't see the question.
yeah, there's one
Yeah.
more question that I think is quite global, Zamira, that might be helpful for the audience to hear about. Someone asked, have the rates of anxiety in youth increased? If yes, are there any reasons why our society struggles so much with anxiety at such a young age? Is this due to parental accommodation / demand, or something else? Why does this seem to be the
Well,
case?
it's a wonderful question. And in fact, there is a new book that's come out in the last, I think, month or so called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And he explains, he has a whole theory around it. He's a psychologist from NYU, and he's written a very good book that really delves into the various reasons. And one of them is overprotection, that we've become a society, especially in North America, that really overprotects, that we don't allow our kids to experience risk. Risk taking has become almost a bad thing, bad parenting, when it used to be part of parenting. He also talks a lot about social media and that sort of thing, but he does talk about the other stuff as well. And we do see an increase, absolutely we do. And there's a lot of factors that are contributing to it. And yes, part of it is overprotection.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank everybody for being here. So many great questions. Please remember, we're going to have time to have more of this question and answer period. We are going to dive in next week to talking about accommodations and how we can think about how we reduce those. As Zamir said, in the meantime, practice your supportive statements, take note of how your accommodations are taking place within your families. Rewatch this if you want, once Learn sends it out to all of us. And please remember to sign up if you haven't already. If you signed up only for tonight, it's not your ticket to session 2 and 3. There's a separate sign up for each of the 3 sessions. It's really easy on the website where you initially registered. So don't forget to do so. And we look forward to continuing our conversation really soon.
And we will be sending the PowerPoint. So a lot of the information will be sent to you, and the examples, I think that will be helpful as well.
Yes, and we will send the titles of those books as well. So I just saw that skim by in the chat. We'll make sure that you get all the resources that we talked about this evening. So thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.